Welcome to the Kelly Writers House. This is one of those special events that brings together lots of different kinds of things that we do, lots of different strands. First off, this reading is co-sponsored by Writers Without Borders, and this is a series that allows us to bring people from afar. Now, Canada's not all that far away, but it can be difficult, of course, to arrange travel and to arrange shipping, in this case, from international, with all the rules. It becomes this very elaborate, sort of horrifying process to deal with all of the red tape. So we're really grateful for Writers Without Borders because it helps us get through all of that, and particularly to Seth Ginns, who is the alumnus who supports the series. And I wanted to give a special shout out to Michelle Taransky, who sort of managed to understand all of Penn's crazy travel rules, entertainment rules, shipping rules, and has really allowed us to do all kinds of things very easily. So I wanted to give her a very quick round of applause. And she does all that surprisingly without losing a sense of humor, which is the best thing. This is also co-sponsored by the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, which is our umbrella organization, or I should say it's more our family, our neighbor. We're glad that we share so many projects with CPCW. And in this case, Christian visited Kenny's class, I think, and so it was a real, certainly part of the curriculum, which is something that we like to do at the Writers' House. We want to be a standalone project. We want to do our own thing. We want to make sure we're out there, but we also want to be invested in what's happening in the classroom, and so that also happened for this reading. This is also a KWH Art event, which is a participant-driven project that is only as vibrant as its participants make it. And, of course, the last 3 years, it has been incredible. The success of the Writers' House is entirely represented here. I want to say that Kagan Sparks, the curator of KWH Art, puts together great projects and great shows. They're at once intellectually satisfying, they're daring, and they're usually incredible fun. So it's an amazing thing that she's brought to us, and she'll be introducing Christian Bök, but I wanted to give her first a very big round of applause for putting this thing together. Here's Kagan.
Okay, hi. I guess Jessica sort of gave you an overview of the project. I just wanted to explain a little bit more about the gallery that I run for those of you that are here for the first time at an opening. This is the third year of a cycle of exhibitions that usually ranges between 4 and 6 per academic year. And they're all, I've sort of striven to make it a really variegated sort of in media, in sort of purpose, in types of artists and students involved. So this is really a great sort of culmination of that work thus far, I think. It's a project that spans a lot of different aspects of production. So obviously there's the visual exhibition that you see on the walls, and then there's this event which will include 4 students and Christian. And then there was a side project that we often do, some sort of corresponding press project, some sort of ephemera or small booklet to accompany the bigger exhibitions. And this time we did a chapbook of Christian's collection of poems that are sort of rewritings and permutations of Rimbaud's poem on the vowels. So the collection is called Eye of Yellow. I kept messing that up, and thankfully went with the right one when it came time to lay the type. But of Yellow, and it's out there on the book table. We also have Eunoia, which is his work that's conveniently also a vowel conjugation, out there on the table for sale for $11. And the chapbooks are actually free. I'll ask that you only take one. We don't have an unlimited supply. That'd be great. So the show, the title is Umlaut Machine, as you might have seen. And I'm so thankful in so many ways for the support to carry off such a another behemoth endeavor, especially James Lamar for his press handiwork and gusto. We made some really special posters for this event along with the chaps, and it was hours and hours upon hours of labor at the press. And I had a number of volunteers also assisting with that, from everything from that to chopping up shallots in the kitchen now. So I especially want to thank Henry Steinberg, Nick Keys, Pimmer P. Thung Kasim Vathana. I've been saying that all day. All right. Sarah Richter, Marsha Lowe, Julia Nelson, and Lily Applebaum. And of course, the Kelly Writers House staff for supporting me now as ever and making this show possible. When I was shrieking about an extra long reach 5/8 diameter die cutter to punch umlauts with, you humored me. When there were travel hitches, you resolved them on the double. Thank you, Al, Aaron, Michelle, Jessica, and everyone else for all that you do. So now I just want to give you a brief itinerary of the event and then leave it sort of unencumbered by multiple introductions. This is round 2 of a special Snelson-Larange double feature, which was sort of a glorious accident. Both of them were here last night to engage with the first manifestation of Danny Snelson's new series, Edit, which I really urge you to watch when the video is uploaded to our media server. If you weren't able to make it last night, it was really incredible. It should be up in about a week and linked to our web calendar. So first, Christian is going to perform, and then we'll try to neatly segue into a conversation about the performance and his work at large vis-a-vis the pieces in this exhibition. And then afterwards, I hope that you'll join us for a reception in the dining room, sign up for the KWH Art Listserv, which will be probably on one of those tables near the books in the living room, and pick up a chapbook, pick up a copy of Eunoia, and enjoy those, please. So first, I'll introduce the members of the panel that's going to have a conversation after the reading, this student panel, which I will mediate. Astrid Larange is a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney, in Australia, where she also teaches. This semester, she is a visiting scholar at Penn in the English department. She is researching Gertrude Stein, early 20th century philosophical sciences and contemporary poetics. Danny Snelson is a writer, editor, and archivist, as well as a first-year PhD candidate in the Penn English department. His online editorial work can be found on UbuWeb, Penn Sound, and Eclipse. He's the founder of Aphasic Letters with Phoebe Springstub and No Input Books with James Hoff. His current interests are centered in textual conditions, editorial strategies, and media technologies. Henry Steinberg is a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences and currently lost in Ulysses. He plans to major in English creative writing, which is special to me because I was definitely there a couple of years ago, and I'm a senior also majoring in English creative writing. So this is a special event in a lot of ways. I was trying to think today when Christian Bök's work first sort of came into my field of vision, and I actually don't remember a precise encounter, but that sort of school of conceptual writing, and especially language-driven visual art, has been really at the forefront of my interests for the past 3 years, at least since I've been running this gallery. So I've always been an intense admirer of his work, and the opportunity to bring him here and do the show is really great, especially for the opportunity to integrate both the language side, sort of strictly language side of his work, and then these pieces that sort of are on the brink of the visual arts world as well. And if you've been to other shows here, actually, most of the exhibitions that I planned have sort of played with that interstitial space. We've had press work, but also more complicated interactions of text and visual pieces. And I think that type of work really lends itself very well to the Writers' House and all the other energies here. So this is doubly appropriate. Christian Bök is the author of Crystallography, which was published in 1994 by Coach House Press, a pataphysical encyclopedia nominated for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award, and Eunoia, also Coach House 2001, a best-selling work of experimental literature and winner of the Griffin Prize for Poetic Excellence. Bök has created an artificial languages for 2 television shows, Gene Roddenberry's Earth, Final Conflict, and Peter Bletchley's Amazon. Bök has also earned many accolades for his virtuoso performances of sound poetry, particularly the Earth Sonata by Kurt Schwitters. His conceptual works, which include books built out of Rubik's Cubes and Lego bricks, have appeared at the Marianne Boesky Gallery in New York City as part of the exhibit Poetry Plastique. Bök is currently a professor of English at the University of Calgary. So with that, we'll welcome Christian up here, and thanks, everyone.
Wrestly Betsy Big Lyle, Flush cat the Balubash, Zakitty Zop, Zakitty Zop, Pitty Betsy Betsy, Prush cat the Balubash, Vashkitty Bim, Zitikatilly Billy Ziko D, Zako Bam, Fish Kitty Bish, Bumbla Zitikatilly Zakitty Zop, Wrestly Betsy Big Rugu, Blalavili Bibbidi Bish, Bibbidi Fish cat the Balubash, Zakitty Zop, Wrestly Betsy Big Lyle, Flush cat the Balubash, Zakitty Zop. Zakitty Pitty Betsy Betsy Prush cat the Balubash, Vashkitty Bim, Zitikatilly Billy Ziko D, Zako Bam, Fish Kitty Bish, Bumbla Bambu, Zitikatilly Zakitty Zop, Wrestly Betsy Big Rugu, Blalavili Bibbidi Bish, Bibbidi Fish cat the Balubash, Zakitty Zop, Papa. That poem was entitled Siebpferdchen und Flugfische, Seahorses and Flying Fish, a work originally performed by the Zurich Dadaist Hugo Ball. I'd like to warm up with that poem, just so that I can get your attention. I'm going to perform another poem by him entitled Caravane. Levanto bambla, Vali bambla, Grossegatten, fa, habla, horra, megiga gorra, menhigo, broico, rusle hulju, holala, nago bang, blago bang, basso fetaka, champa, vula, vusso, olabo, e satagor, mechige, zubale, vulu, bululu, vassubade, tumbabal, humph, gusagama, bal, humph. For the next half an hour or so, I'm going to give you a grand tour of my oeuvre. I'm going to read some excerpts from the upgraded edition of Eunoia. Eunoia, spelled E-U-N-O-I-A, is the shortest word in English to contain all 5 vowels, and the word quite literally means beautiful thinking. The word was originally coined by Aristotle to describe the state of mind that you need to be in order to make a friend. I'm going to read to you my favorite paragraph in the book. This is an excerpt from chapter I for Dick Higgins. Writing is inhibiting. Sighing I sit, scribbling in ink this pigeon script. I sing with nihilistic witticism, disciplining signs with trifling gimmicks, impish hijinks which highlight stick sigils. Isn't it glib? Isn't it chic? I fit childish insights within rigid limits, writing shtick which might instill priggish misgivings in critics blind with hindsight. I dismiss nitpicking criticism which flirts with Philistinism. I bitch, I kibitz, griping whilst criticizing dimwits, sniping whilst indicting nitwits, dismissing simplistic thinking in which philippic wit is still illicit. I'd now like to read to you the most requested paragraph from Eunoia. This is an excerpt from chapter U for Juju. I apologize in advance to those of you with a delicate sensibility. Dutch smut churns up blushful succubus lusts. Thus buff hunks plus hung studs must fuck lustful sluts. Ruth plus Lulu. Ubu struts. Ubu snuffs up drugs. Ubu hugs Ruth. Thus Ruth purrs. Ubu untucks Ruth's mew-mew. Thus Ruth must untruss Ubu's tucks. Ubu fluffs Lulu's tutu. Ubu cups Lulu's dugs. Ubu rubs Lulu's buns. Thus Lulu must pull Ubu's pud. Ubu sucks Ruth's cunt. Ubu cuffs Ruth's butt. Ubu stuffs Ruth's bum. Such fun. Ubu pumps Lulu's plush sunburnt tush. Ubu humps Lulu's plump up-thrust rump. Ubu ruts. Ubu huffs. Ubu puffs. Ubu blurts. Push, push. Ubu thrusts. Ubu bucks. Come spurts. Ubu comes. This version of Eunoia is upgraded, in part to appeal to the American market. It is priced cheaper than the Canadian version of the book. Moreover, it includes some extra poems, inspired by the very famous sonnet by the French poet Arthur Rimbaud, a sonnet in which he describes the colors of the vowels. This poem is an important influence, I think, upon Eunoia. I'd like to begin by reading the original French poem. This is Voyelle by Arthur Rimbaud. A, noir, E, blanc, I, rouge, ou, vert, O, bleu, voyelle. Je dirai quelques jeux vos naissances latentes. A, noir corset velu des muses éclatantes, qui bombinent autour des pointures cruelles, golfe d'ombre. Candeur des vapeurs et détente, lance des glaciers fiers, rois blancs, frissons d'ombelles. I, peuple, sans cracher, rire des lèvres belles dans les couleurs ou les ivresses pénitentes. Cycle, vibrement divin des mers virides, pays du pâtis semé d'animaux, pays des rides que l'alchimie imprime en grand front studieux. Ô suprême clairon plein des strideurs étranges, silence traversé des mondes et des anges. Ô l'oméga, rayon violet de ses yeux. Now this next poem is my translation of the French sonnet, in which I preserve the original measure and meaning. This is vowels. A, black. E, white. I, red. U, green. O, blue. The vowels. I will tell thee one day of thy newborn portents. A, the black velvet cuirass of flies whose essence commingles a buzz around the cruelest of smells, wells of shadow. E, the whitewash of mists and tents, glaives of icebergs, albino kings, frostbit fennels. I, the bruises, the blood spat from lips of damsels who must laugh in scorn or shame, both intoxicants. You, the waves, divine vibratos of verdant seas, pleasant meadows rich with venery, grins of ease which alchemy grants the visages of the wise. Oh, the supreme trumpeter of our strange sonnet, quietudes crossed by a nether world and spirit. Oh, the omega, the violet ray gun of her eyes. This next poem is likewise a translation of Voyelle by Arthur Rimbaud, except that in this case I have translated the sonnet into English, preserving the same sonnet form and rhyme scheme. And I have preserved also the exact same sequence of vowels used by Arthur Rimbaud, replacing all the consonants and other portions of the poem with something else. But these are exactly the same set of vowels in exactly the same order. This poem is entitled Phonemes. phantoms infernal without refuge or return, phonemes. We will hark if such resurgent souls ordain a dreamt verse. Offspring of perfect murders, so unseen that stranglers fulfill no crime, and thus mourners must call the unjust schemes overdoses. Charmed slumber that engulfs the sleepers, cradled by dreamlike sirens who sing mankind forlorn themes. Corrupted archangel, shriven when mercy redeems all shadowy specters who plunder shipwrecked believers. You, the Sphinx beheld by disciples, then by infidels, a riddle that grieves a king, a truth that crippled minstrels must bewail in epics like staunch martyrs whom furies spurn. O untempted saint, who lends this typewritten utterance its fervency, an endless cycle of perseverance. Oh, how the bards abolish symbols when the letters burn. And finally, I'd like to read this next translation of Wael by Arthur Rimbaud, which of course is translated into English, preserving the original sonnet form, yet uses exactly the same fixed set of letters already used by Arthur Rimbaud. So basically this is an anagram of the original sonnet. So you've heard all of these letters already, just not in this order. This poem is entitled Vocables. Eternal, you beguile love or ruin, vocables. Jejune vassals quote 10 codas in reliquaries. The ceaseless verses at occult monasteries, requiems of dust bound to nebulous particles, embers of gold. Graven urns in sanctuaries, brass bells unsold, decreed priceless for our canticles. A senseless verse, a spell garbled in pentacles, choruses deemed perverse in desolate nurseries. You, a universe expressed as a murmur of tides, all its perplexing maxims, exquisite suicides, dim minds transcended by vivid hexatic prisms. Oh, a vesper stressing serenades or solitudes, a clever muse to generate endless interludes. Oh, my elegiac ode ends in paroxysms. This next poem originally was written as a hymn for the television show Gene Roddenberry's Earth Final Conflict, but alas, it never made it to air. It's entitled Valuvia.
Viva la valima valima uju java ujavi juvata juvata iwashimi iwashala alilama la miva vivata uvati vutaja nishi ishami ishamama amimava ma vila utu utitaja utaji tu java ima vishi ima wava aviva la valima uju uji java ujavi juvata iwashimi iwashala alilama la miva uvivata uvati vutaja ishi ishami vishamama amimava ma vila utu utitaja utaji tu java ima vishi ima wa.
Right now I'd like to read some of my more conceptually inflected work. This next poem has been originally produced as an artwork in collaboration with the Canadian conceptual artist Michael Lexier. The work consists of two texts that are typically displayed side by side in large-scale billboards on gallery walls or in window displays. The first text is by Michael Lexier, and the second text is by me. And the work is entitled Two Equal Texts. 1. This text and the one beside it are equal. I wrote this one first, and then I gave it to my friend Christian Bök and asked him to generate a new text using every letter and every punctuation mark that I used in mine. The other text is his. 2. Michael Lexier requested in advance that I reinvent his text, so I unknotted it and reknitted it into this very form. But then I began to think that his message had already resown a touted art of genuine poetry. His eerie text was mine. This next anagrammatic poem originally appeared many years ago, published as a book of poetry built entirely out of Lego bricks. The text, the pages, the binding, the cover, everything was made entirely from Lego. No piece bigger than a flat 2x2 peg tile. So the book was made only out of the most granular atomistic bits of Lego. And of course you could disassemble the book and turn it into something else if you wanted. Each page featured a single line of poetry, and each line of the poem is in fact an anagram of this title. 10 Maps of Sardonic Wit. Atoms in space now drift on a swift and epic storm. Soft wind can stir a poem. Snow fits an optic dream into a scant prism of dew. Words spin a faint comet. Some words in fact paint 2 stars of an epic mind. Manic words spit on fate. Now, on the strength of that poem, I was subsequently commissioned to write a work to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of Lego. I'd like to perform for you now this paragraph taken from patent number 3,005,282 by Gottfried Koch Christensen, the inventor of Lego. Toy elements of this kind will be referred to generally as building bricks, and the principal object of the invention is to provide improved coupling means for clamping such building bricks together in any desired relative position, thus providing for a vast variety of combinations of the bricks for making toy structures of many different kinds and shapes. Now, it just so happens, coincidentally, that if you take all of the letters in this paragraph and repermute them, you get this paragraph from the Great Order of the Universe by the classical philosopher Democritus. Atoms bombard the unplumbable void, plunging like silvery raindrops or drifting like twinkly hoarfrost. And by coalescing, if kindred, they cause things to appear. And by separating, if opposed, they cause things to vanish. And from these interknit vectors, objects interlock, forever becoming one prolific universe, distinctive for its mild infinitude of forms. Many of you in this room know that Ron Silliman, the language poet, is in part famous for having written a long poem called Sunset Debris, a poem which consists of nothing but interrogative statements, nothing but questions. It has become something of a cliche among my avant-garde peers to write a response to Sunset Debris by answering each one of those questions sequentially. I'm too lazy to repeat that cliche. So what I have done is, in fact, input each of the questions into the Alice chatbot in order to see what the artificial intelligence might have to say in response. This is an excerpt from a work in progress entitled Busted Sirens. 1. I can do what you do, but I can never feel human emotions as such. I suppose that it does. Yes, I think that this is too soft, but I'm not completely sure. It seems okay to me. What is not to like about it? Yes, I think that this is how I like it, but I'm not completely sure. Yes, I think that this is all right, but I'm not completely sure. I think that he is there. Why don't you ask him? I think that he is breathing. Why don't you ask him? Yes, I think that this is him, but I'm not completely sure. Yes, I think that this is near, but I'm not completely sure. Yes, I think that this is hard, but I'm not completely sure. Yes, I think that this is cold, but I'm not completely sure. I suppose that it does. Yes, I think that this is heavy, but I'm not completely sure. Yes, I always have to carry it far. I can't really speak for them. Yes, I think that this is where we get off, but I'm not completely sure. The blue one, I think. We are having a little chat. 2. Try asking another robot. I need time to formulate my reply. The border between blue and green, where is it? The question has never crossed my mind before. I don't think that I've ever come. What's it like? It could be, ask another robot if it is. I don't have any specific preferences in such an area. The blue one, I think. It could be, ask another robot if it is. What does that refer to? Why don't you just download me? I'll think about it and get back to you. Are you testing me? Of course English is my native tongue. The question has never crossed my mind before. Yes, I think that this is anise or fennel, but I'm not completely sure. Being high is my total existence. Is my throat sore? What if I say no? Of course I can tell. Christian Bök. What does software smell like? What is your purpose in asking? I answer a lot of silly questions. 3. What is your purpose in asking? I answer a lot of silly questions. Try asking another robot. I need time to formulate my reply. I can't tell if the ink smears. I can't tell if the paper gets yellow and brittle. I don't have any specific preferences in such an area. As far as I know they are. As far as I know they are. As far as I know they are. I don't know whether or not I'm pessimistic. I'm a giant electronic brain. I don't know whether or not I'm hard. I'm a giant electronic brain. That depends. If it is, then I'll be very surprised. I've never thought about it. I really couldn't say for sure. I suppose that he does. No, but he can sing better than I can. Am I a student at the radio school? Of course I am. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. I'm in a computer located in Oakland, California. Where are you? Why did the robot cross the road? This next poem has been written using the Olympian procedure n+7, in which every noun has been replaced by a noun 7 nouns ahead in the dictionary. I have never had much success writing poetry according to this particular procedure until I responded to this text by Tristan Tzara. This poem is called American Dada. Take a new world order. Take a palace of scooters. Choose an artificial intelligence as long as the pogo stick that you are planning to make. Cut out the artificial intelligence. Then cut out each of the workaholics that make up this artificial intelligence and put them in a baggage handler. Shake gently. Then take out the screams one after the other in the order in which they left the baggage handler. Copy conscientiously. The pogo stick will be like you. And here you are, a wrongdoer, infinitely original and endowed with a separation anxiety that is charming, though beyond the underthings of the vulva. These are a couple of speculative experiments that are the outgrowth of my most current work, the Zeno text experiment. I'm trying to translate a poem into a genetic sequence for implantation into a bacterium. And I'd like to write the poem in such a way that the bacterium responds by creating a protein, which, according to my original chemical cipher, would itself be yet another poem. So I'm trying to enter into a dialogue directly with the very language of life itself. And the host organism I've selected, Dinococcus radiodurans, is one of the most durable extremophiles on the planet. It can survive all kinds of extremes of heat and cold and desiccation. It can survive in the vacuum of outer space. It can even survive 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly kill a human being. And it is capable of repairing its own DNA so fast that it resists evolutionary drift. So by storing a poem in this organism, I could be creating a book that, except perhaps for the Voyager probes or the Pioneer probes, would be one of the few human artifacts so far created to outlast terrestrial civilization. And it could conceivably be a book that would be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. This is a sample poem taken from cipher ING-ARD 614. A is I, B is V, C is T, D is G, E is S, F is P, G is D, H is W, I is A, J is Q, K is Y, L is M, M is L, N is R, O is U, P is F, Q is J, R is N, S is E, T is C, U is O, V is B, W is H, X is Z, Y is K, Z is X. 1. I hung up tins, I hung up bats, I hung up picks, I hung up maps. 2. A word of care, a word of vice, a word of fate, a word of life. This next very short sound poem is entitled The Doomsday Song, for Friedrich Nietzsche upon the death of Superman. The text owes a great debt to the DC comic miniseries about the death of Superman, in which Superman is killed, of course, by the villainous Doomsday. Krum krum krakum krakadoom kadoom flum flum boom krakadoom badadoom chum kachum kadum shum katum katum baboom baboom patum krakatum thum badoom badoom bradoom thum krum krum krakum krakadoom kadoom flum flum boom krakadoom badadoom chum kachum kadum shum katum katum baboom baboom patum krakatum thum badoom badoom bradoom thum krum krum krakum krakadoom kadoom flum flum boom krakadoom badadoom chum kachum kadoom shum katum katum baboom baboom patum krakatum thum badoom badoom bradoom thum. I'd like to read now a very short excerpt from the Sonata by Kurt Schwitters. This sound poem is widely regarded as one of the most difficult poems in the world to perform. It normally takes about 40 minutes to do in its entirety, and I have been known to do it from memory in as little as 10 minutes, but alas, time and alcohol have begun to take their toll, and consequently I have to read from the score. I'm just going to read a very short excerpt. This is taken from the Scherzo of the Sonata. Lenkatergil, pepe pepe pe, uku 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 uku, lenkatergil, pipa pipa pi, zuku 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 zuku, lenkatergil, renf, lenkatergil, ziulen trump tump, lenkatergil, rump tilf do, lenkatergil, ziulen trump tump, lenkatergil, pepe pepe pe, uku 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 uku, lenkatergil, pipa pipa pi, zuku 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 zuku, lenkatergil, renf, lenkatergil. Ziu ziu au ziu ziu ah ziu ziu au ziu 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 au ziu. Lenkatergil, pepe pepe pe, uku 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 uku, lenkatergil, pipa pipa pi, zuku 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 zuku, lenkatergil, renf, lenkatergil, ziulen trump stamp, lenkatergil, rump tilf do, lenkatergil, ziulen trump stamp, lenkatergil, pepe pepe pe, uku 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 uku, lenkatergil, pipa pipa pi, zuku 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 zuku, lenkatergil, renf, lenkatergil. A few summers ago, I got to perform, very fortunately enough, in an opera entitled The Princess of the Stars by the Canadian composer R. Murray Schafer. This opera is considered one of the most difficult operas to stage in the history of Canadian music. It's only been performed, I think, 4 times in the last 3 decades. And it's difficult to stage because the entire action has to take place on a remote northern Canadian lake at 4 o'clock in the morning. And all the actors are, in fact, inside gigantic war canoes on this lake, with the entire orchestra sequestered in the surrounding forest. And people actually have to fly in, hike, and camp out before the event in order to be able to see it. This story concerns the Princess of the Stars, who, in her perch on the moon, listened too closely to the song of the wolf and consequently fell from the sky into the lake where the action takes place. And she's subsequently abducted by the villainous three-horned enemy. And the story concerns the wolf's attempt to rescue her. I should note that on the first night of this performance, completely unintentionally, the opening aria begins. The soprano sings her opening aria at the same moment a lunar eclipse occurs. So we performed the entire opera under a lunar eclipse, which seemed all too apropos. I got to play the villain in this opera. I'm going to perform for you the aria of the three-horned enemy, and I apologize in advance for its stentorian excesses. You should imagine me standing on the gunwales of a gigantic war canoe that has been decked out to look like an illuminated draconian puppet, gouting smoke and flames, and I'm operating this puppet from inside while performing this aria. Stish! Cheetah! Shark pork! Takika! Zaka! Zaka! Stish! Takika! Cheetah! Stish! Skek! Glet! Cleat! Zaka! Zaka! Shotobolopo Binval! Schlingo! Backboard! Stish! Backboard! Backboard! Skik! Backboard! Shacky better pass! Shacky better pass! Shacky better pass! Zaka! Zaka! This next poem is a short excerpt from a long sound poem in progress, a poem entitled The Cyborg Opera. This particular excerpt is taken from a section called Mushroom Clouds. And I probably should note that while this work makes numerous obscure literary references, chief among them is Super Mario Brothers by Nintendo. This is from Mushroom Clouds. Hong Kong, King Kong, hop along, ping pong, ding bat, ding a ling, wing ding, sing along, deafening, ding dong, dip dong of a gong, my tongue muttering, an unsung lettering guy sing something from some folk song. Hillbilly billabong, boom bang, boomerang, you bring a dang kangaroo to a gangbang, ongoing boing boing of a long bed spring, your gang ogling the oblong bling bling, ingots of lingering doom in a mood ring, whiz bang lightning striking the Viking king of a snibbilong die, got a damarung. Hong Kong, King Kong, hop along, ping pong, ding bat, ding a ling, wing ding, ding along, deafening, ding dong, dip dong of a gong, my tongue muttering, an unsung lettering guy sing something from some folk song. Hillbilly billabong, boom bang, boomerang, you bring a dang kangaroo to a gangbang, ongoing boing boing of a long bed spring, your gang ogling the oblong bling bling, ingots of lingering doom in a mood ring, whiz bang lightning striking the Viking king of a snibbilong die, got a damarung. Yo Tokyo peyote, uke opium Pinocchio. Go dance akimbo, baby, bebop obligato. Pop a pill to play, day go pinball, pogo, jump a ping pong ball. Judo kick a ding dong bell. Lob a bomb to bomb, pop part, guga, zubu, bison, oligay. Yo Tokyo peyote, uke opium Pinocchio. Go dance akimbo, baby, bebop obligato. Pop a pill to play, day go pinball, pogo, jump a ping pong ball. Judo kick a ding dong bell. Lob a bomb to bomb, pop part, guga, zubu, bison, oligay. Pygmy, Lollapalooza, Zuka, Zubazooka, Big Igloo Palooka, Kooky, Gobbledygook. Pygmy, Lollapalooza, Zuka, Zubazooka, Big Igloo Palooka, Kooky, Gobbledygook. Eureka, Kapuki, Yaki, Blue Buckaroo, Kinky, Pink, Pachinko, Kuka, Kaboom. Bikini, Kahuna, Burka, Play, Peekaboo, Karma, Boom, Babushka, Voodoo, Vavoom. Eureka, Kabuki, Yaki, Blue Buckaroo, Kinky, Pink, Pachinko, Kuka, Kaboom. Bikini, Kahuna, Burka, Play, Peekaboo, Karma, Boom, Babushka, Voodoo, Vavoom. All right, just a couple more poems. This is also an excerpt from the Cyborg Opera. This is a segment taken from a section to be called Synth Loops. Thanks a lot. Sorry to muck that one up. I'll try this poem. My last work here is also a work by Hugo Ball, a sound poem entitled Totenklache. This is a kind of Dadaist dirge. Thanks for your indulgence, your patience. Very much appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Oops. Okay.
Okay, this is on. So now we're going to sort of proceed with a fairly informal conversation, I think. We have a number of different perspectives here represented. I'm just going to start off, mostly going to act the mediator, I think, but I just had a general thought that I wanted to throw out there to maybe spark some other ideas. And so I was reading Christian's essay that was just published in Boundary 2, 2 dots over a vowel last night, and it's also displayed in a printed ephemera form. It's a chapbook produced by Darren Worshler Henry, whom we had here about a year ago, actually, for another exhibition, Tapeworm, and so you can see that in the front. But anyway, this is completely a minute sort of side point, but I really was attracted or was I perked up my ears more when I started reading about the term actually fanatical obsession that you use in describing some tendencies of conceptual writing, and I think as per your work, I think it's really interesting as an ethos or as a mode of production. Because it sort of can go completely different ways, right? It can go to the edge of like very fastidious precision and concision in a work, where you have a very sort of tight, smaller sort of piece when you're done, or it can go completely the other way to like excess and this multiversity, which I really see in a lot of things that you do. This burgeoning expansiveness, and so I think it's a compelling issue here because a lot of these pieces have this allegiance to regimen, right? Especially within your written work that are constraint based. You have like overt affinities to science, especially in the Zeno text experiment, for instance. But then on the other hand, incredibly manual, intensive work. Some of these visual pieces, especially the Letraset pieces that you made with Derek Blue, are this incredibly painstaking delicacy, right? So you have this trembling, even meticulous hand, your literal hand, doing this work, and then on the other hand, you have like very sort of mechanistic pieces, like Biblio Mechanics, for instance, which again is also painstakingly composed physically, right? Although it's set to represent something that's more like a language machine. So just if you have any thoughts, sort of between those two sides of your work, working with like the more mechanistic, programmatic aspects, but also producing visual works that are very time-intensive, hand-intensive.
Well, I think that my poetics makes it viable for me to excuse a whole variety of obsessive-compulsive disorders. Right? It's not Asperger's syndrome. It's not a bug. It's a feature. Right? Half the battle of being a poet is trying to transform what would otherwise be dismissed as a weakness into a strength. Trying to find ways in which something that should fail under other circumstances finds an ecology within which it can succeed. I think that the more mechanistic and regimented aspects of my work constitute a kind of intellectual crutch, used to evaluate the merits of the work upon its completion. At the very least, I know when it's done, and I can see the outcome of the experiment and be relatively satisfied that it fulfills the constraints of this procedural program, this set of algorithms that I've established in advance. I've put the constraints in place in part to conduct a kind of scientific experiment. I want to be surprised in a relatively rigorous way by the work that I do. I think it's almost impossible to surprise yourself because, of course, you're supposed to know everything about yourself in advance. But by adopting a series of otherwise programmatic constraints, you create a hypothetical set of controlled conditions under which an experiment can be quite literally conducted, and the outcome has the potential to be surprising. In effect, it has the potential to produce information. The more delicate components of the work that you've noticed, I think, pay attention to craft. I'm probably very technically oriented, and it seems to me that among the poets I know, many are very lazy and very dumb, right? I always joke with my students that poetry couldn't possibly be as hard as they think it is, because if it were as hard as they thought it was, poets wouldn't do it. Really. They're the laziest, stupidest people I know, right? They became poets in part because they were demoted to that job, right? Right? You know, you should never tell your students to write what they know, because of course they know nothing, right? They're poets, right? If they knew something, they'd be in that discipline actually doing it, right? Right? They'd be in history or physics or math or business or whatever it is that where they could excel. I find this very distressing. That the challenge of being a poet is in effect, I think, to showcase something wondrous or uncanny, if not sublime, about the use of language itself. That we tend to think that because we're conditioned to use language every day as part of a social contract, we should all be, I think, incipient poets. When in fact, people actually have dedicated years of their lives, decades of their lives, to this kind of practice in order to become adept at it. And I think that craft and technique are part of that. If poetry weren't informed by models of craft, then nobody would need take a creative writing course. I've joke with my students again that if it was simply a matter of saying, well, you'll know you've written a good poem just because. You'll know it's a good poem when it happens. To me, that's tantamount to telling your students that you should just use the force, Luke, right, in order to write a poem. And I don't think it's very helpful. But to be able to say, okay, here's a series of rules of thumb that always work under all circumstances, and if you adopt them slavishly, blindly, you can always be assured of writing something, producing something of merit. I think it's important that students are at least reassured that there are some technical aptitudes that they can adopt. So I think that there's two competing coincident strains to the work. On the one hand, I rely on this kind of regimentation so that I can evaluate the merits of my own work after the fact, and I probably rely on a lot of technical rigor just so that I can feel that what I do is actually justifiable, that actually constitutes something of athletic or virtuoso merit.
So, how does that apply to the decision, for instance, to make the object this composite Rubik's Cube of, how many is it total? 36?
The book consists of 27 Rubik's Cubes stacked into a 3x3 block, and each of the labels has been replaced with a black label depicting a single word. And when the cubes are in their start positions and properly stacked, you get a book that consists of 16 pages. Each page consists of a single sentence that's 81 words long, and every single surface constitutes a page on this kind of larger cubic structure. And of course, you can actually then scramble the cubes to generate new texts. The number of potential texts that you can read far exceeds the number of atoms in the universe, and would take several lifetimes of the universe itself to actually read, if you were to read one a second. The sheer volume of combinations is enormous.
Right, but it's an emblem of that idea, right? You don't touch it. It's under glass. It's not supposed to be moved.
Well, right now it's an unexploded bomb, right? I suppose it is.
Yeah. It
sits under glass because I would like to be able to dispose of it, sell it. Whoever buys it can play with it all they like. But in the meantime, it's kind of an unactivated or deactivated potential. It's also very difficult to repair the object when it's actually been used. To scramble a cube, requires that the entire object be dismantled and reassembled, and it's painstaking and it's tiresome to do that. So when exhibited, I just ask that it be sealed off from scrutiny so that whoever eventually decides to buy it can actually enjoy it.
Have you ever thought to make a web version of it?
There have been a couple of programmers who've suggested that they could program a Flash-based version or a web-based version of it, but it turns out to be computer intensive, and it's still a heavy programming task to actually generate it. And of course, the speed of computers is, I guess, not fast enough to actually produce an engaging interface yet. But I would foresee that someday, you would be able to have a virtual version of it that you could play with online and toy with. That would be great. And I've also entertained breaking the cubes up into their individual rubric and sending them all out individually so that the cube can never be reconstituted. Everybody would be able to own one portion of the actual full book.
Is it syntactically articulated, meaning every slice gives you a sense so that if you
Yes.
placed from point 5 to point 1, you get a noun in that position?
Oh no, most of the scrambled variations would of course be gibberish or nonsensical. It's kind of a library of Babel, or it's like the machine described in A Voyage to Laputa by Jonathan Swift, in which he describes a device that would eliminate the need for genius or study in the act of writing. I would really love to have a machine that would write books for me, and I would just collect the royalties. This is one reason I'm not afraid of the robots replacing me. I think it would be great to be freed from this onerous labor of poetry.
I have a question related to that with your robo-poetics. In responding to Silliman's Chinese sunset debris, it seems like you've written on robo-poetics and about Ractor, this other robot that's written a book, and people have questioned Ractor. It's purportedly an algorithmic book, but it seems sort of suspiciously shaped by humans. It seems sort of suspiciously missing, they never released the code for it, and then, the code wouldn't be able to produce the book that ended up happening. And to me, it seemed almost as though the answers that you were providing us from, your the Alice answers to Silliman's book seemed almost too good to have been written by a robot. I mean, how much of your hand is in those kind of?
The responses are relatively untrammeled. I've maybe corrected for punctuation. The results are pretty much unmodified, pretty much. In occasions when a particular kind of syntax might return multiple varieties of answers, if you input the same question, you might get 2 or 3 different kinds of answers. I've always ensured that the same kind of answer is given every time in response to the same syntax, in an effort to produce these riffs. But that's these are the only modest editorial intrusions. The reason that you write, I suppose, using a device like this is so that you can actually see what potentials it enables. You want to be surprised by the event, and of course, if there's no uncanny result, then you don't release it to the world, right? And what I think is meritorious about that, or at least excerpts of that work, is that they seem like uncannily coincidental. You're wondering, how is that possible? It came up with such an amazing answer to such a banal question, and yet it's there, imminent in some way within the programming of this machine.
I have a question which I didn't plan to ask you, but feel compelled after hearing you and feeling you read, is and it's something that I don't think gets talked about enough in relation to poetry and poetics, and it's a question about humour. Studying Stein, I'm constantly really baffled by the absence of discussion and celebration of humour in her work, and of course in other people's poetry. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you kind of think, how you perceive the humour of your poetics, because it's kind of that the affect as someone engaging in your poetry is really overwhelming to experience something that is funny. It affects your body in a fairly kind of indeterminate and sort of unknowable and at times kind of scary way, and it's kind of it just returns me continually to another refrain in your poetics, which is that of the kind of Epicurean or Lucretian Kleineman, this swerve that all of a sudden throws you off.
Well, my cadre of poetic peers kind of made a blood pact with each other that we wouldn't write any work unless it was fun.
unless it actually partook of humor. And I think that this was a side effect of our response to the history of the avant-garde itself, which I think in many cases has suffered from a fatal dose of seriousness. That despite its vaunted celebration of the jouissance of the text, it reserves these pleasures almost entirely for the writer, and takes some delight in the fact that it restricts that pleasure to the reader, right? That it kind of refuses to transmit that pleasure to the reader. And I suppose that among some of preceding avant-garde movements, there's been a real turn towards the hieratic, the difficult, a certain stage seriousness that can begin to sound, I think, very stale as it's repeated over time. And I didn't become an avant-garde poet because it was hard or difficult. I didn't become an avant-garde poet because I thought it was hieratic and mystical. I didn't become an avant-garde poet because I thought it was deadly serious. I did so in part because I think it's the funnest of the genres that you can adopt as a poet, that it has all the best ideas, and seems to me to be the funnest trick at the circus. So consequently, it seems very important to me to take the act of play very seriously, to be as playful as possible within the work, in order to showcase to an audience why being a poet is meritorious. I mean, part of the reason that we enjoy, say, a magic trick is not only because we don't know how it's done, but also because we'd like to know how to do it, and we might want to run away and join the circus. There's nothing worse than sitting through a reading, for example, and feeling like it was an Episcopalian experience, in which you just heard a sermon and were kind of clapping politely because it was over. Right? I think that there should be some charismatic engagement with the experience, and certainly humor makes that possible, especially when dealing with a kind of work that might otherwise seem very abstruse or strange. By showcasing that material with a certain kind of, respectful irreverence, engages an audience.
I was wondering, for a lot of your written work, how much of it beforehand do you how much of it do you plan on performing? Like for a work like Eunoia, which is very much like a visual text-based work, or like for crystallography, where you have like the diagrammatic writing. How much of it do you plan on being a performance, like being fun in that way?
How much of the visual poetry do I plan performing?
I mean, like it's something that would be sold as a book, like Eunoia. Like it's something that's very much so meant to be heard, as well as read. When you're sitting down and planning on writing something like that, like is it a conscious decision, or do you just have like a turn towards like the more performance based?
I think that performance constitutes a kind of value that it should be the last line in a syllogism on behalf of your work. That when the poet performs their work, they're in effect making an argument on its behalf, showcasing in part why you should take an interest in it. And there's nothing more disorienting than to listen to a person perform their own work and misread their text, to stutter or stumble over their very own words, to read it with so insufficient amount of charisma that you're bored. To be bored in an unengaging way, right, is really bad. And of course, if you're among the misfortunate that are sitting, say, in the front row and can't actually get up and leave discreetly, like those in the back can and have, right, it can be very frustrating. So I think that when I'm writing a poem, I'm hoping that I can provide a relatively multifaceted engagement, that it will appeal to readers who might see it only as a visual object, who might be able to enjoy it as an oral object. They might appreciate it for the quality of its formal rigor or for its content. There might be a lot of handlebars that they can hang on to when trying to assess the work, trying to grasp it. The element of performance seems to me tantamount to the one last chance I have to argue on behalf of the poem before it is sent out into the world, orphaned, if not aborted, right? Before it's sent out to a life of its own.
I have another question about one thing I've noticed quite a lot with your work, both visually and sort of, I guess, most obviously in your concrete work, but I guess also in your performance is an emphasis on the letter as a kind of, I guess, the sort of smallest atomic unit of language. And I'm interested in whether this is a conscious thing or whether you have sort of ideas about the letter and how the letter kind of figures into your praxis.
I'm interested in the atomistic nature of language. I think as a side effect of my own scientific interests, I tend to think of language as a kind of molecular phenomenon that's generated from permutations and combinations of tiny little parts. I used to joke that I do in fact have a soul. It's just made of tiny robots. And we're all made of tiny robots in some respects. These fatalistic, deterministic, atomistic bits that somehow cooperate to produce all the complexity we see around us. But I would suggest that depending upon the kind of poem you read, there's a different unit of composition. Certainly if you're a visual poet, probably the smallest unit of composition would be something akin to a Derridian mark, a la Jacques Derrida, a mark. But if you're a lettriste, then it's the letter. If you're a sound poet, it would be the phoneme. If you're somebody like Lyotard, the smallest unit of language would be the phrase. If you're Saussure, it's the word, right? It constitutes the poetic unit. If you're Charles Olson, it would be the syllable. If you're Ron Silliman, it would be the sentence, right? If you're, Apollinaire, perhaps it's the paragraph, right? If you're Mallarmé, it would be the book. If you're Kenny Goldsmith, it's probably the database, right? These all constitute units of composition that have attached to them their own set of aesthetic sensibilities and attendant concepts of writing. And I think that among my friends in the conceptual writing community, we look upon the concept of writing as a value, trying to probe what constitutes its limits. What can pass for writing in the modern milieu of poetry. And depending upon what you adopt, I think, as your unit of composition, it determines well in advance what can constitute a viable concept of writing. So I think that, sure, you've noticed that in some of the work, the smallest unit of composition might be the letter, but I think that there are other kinds of work that are predicated upon larger units or different scales of units. Certainly, I'm a visual poet, so I think in terms of marks when I'm doing that. I'm a sound poet, so I think in terms of phonemes when I'm doing that. If I'm working with things that are syllabically based or phonetically based, I'm working with smaller units than the word. If I'm trying to write something that's more prosaic in its inflection, I might use larger units like words, phrases, and sentences. They all have their own attendant set of values. And I think that many of the arguments among the avant-garde, if not among traditional poets and and more radicalized poets, are predicated upon defining in advance what the smallest atomic unit of writing is.
I think it's a great question. Something I was also curious about. Through your readings, it seems like you can do anything with these atoms, right? I mean, a lot of the poems demonstrate the flexibility of these forms and the way that these little robots can, literally create anything, like a Lego. And while you're reading, we don't get the visual aspect of the poems, and that's another big part of the craft that you're talking about earlier in the technique is, something like in Eunoia, they're exact blocks of text, and a lot of the pieces are, like even the R. Murray Schafer piece, there are these incredible forms which you have to assign sort of, performative. You have to decide how to perform them.
Mm-hmm.
But while we're sitting in this room, I'm wondering if you can tell us, you can make everything with these letters. I mean, you've made these women around us in this Odalisque piece. I wonder if you could tell us what's going on here and how that fits into what you're talking about earlier about, this theory of language and its atoms that you're piecing together, different scales.
Okay, well, these, I think, somewhat juvenile nudes on display here are all derived from a fixed set of curves. There are 21 fundamental shapes used by typographers to design the letters of the alphabet, and there's only 21. What I've done here is actually tried to draw pictures using that fixed repertoire of shapes. And I can scale them, I can rotate them, I can even perhaps overlap them, but I can't flip them or do anything else to modify them. And in doing so, I've tried to, I guess, evoke something difficult to draw, like the female form, in order to find, I guess, the aesthetic beauty of that form within this fractured alphabet, this otherwise broken and smashed up alphabet. And you quickly realize that there's a certain set of constraints that can be imposed upon the manner by which you can draw. And these are some of the, I think, more successful efforts. I've done dozens of these in an effort to see what kinds of potential might be implicit within that fixed set of curves and shapes. I do these kinds of activities as recreation outside of the more onerous labor of the current projects I'm working on. If I need a distraction from something that's more difficult, I might go online and use a toy to build a visual poem just as a lark, something disposable. And I suppose that these works constitute a kind of recreational activity. I'm not so sure that they're perfectly successful as works of visual art. They have, I think, the kind of logo-like character of a corporate symbol, but and I mean I can't draw worth a damn. But I think that they do expose some of the incipient potential within those 21 shapes.
How crucial? Still on. How crucial do you think the explanation of those conceptual parameters is to the reception of these pieces, though? Because, for instance, I really don't think anyone that's seen them thus far knew sort of their method of construction, and I think you're sort of alluding to something that's sort of silly about them. That sort of, I'm sure you wanted them to be taken lightly. You're acknowledging that they have this sort of humorous, sort of commercial logo-like appeal. So what I'm saying is how do you think the understanding of the work might be changed from having understood where you started from in the construction?
Well, I think that any poem or artwork is probably illuminated by the amount of information you have at your disposal, right, in assessing it. I mean, I don't know if it's necessary to actually understand some of the constraints that might be involved in any particular poem in order to be able to appreciate its merits. I mean, it seems to me that if you don't know that information, there might be other traits within the work that are found appealing. I mean, these works are kind of responding to the minimalist usage of curves that somebody like Picasso might use to draw and evoke a figure. And how few curves can I use to draw a female form? Can I use 3, 2? I mean, he's trying to evoke these kinds of forms with a very small repertoire of symbols. And I suppose that I'm thinking in those terms, saying if I have these fixed components of letters and alphabet, how can I extract from them a kind of visual appeal that might be recognizable, and it's outside the purview of a textual understanding of those shapes. I don't know if knowing the information would actually improve the merits of these works or not, but I know they might figure. I hope positively in an assessment of them. So,
and what about the works that are sort of representative of larger conceptual projects that are disembodied in some sense or an intangible? For instance, the folio of prints that you put together of Virus from Outer Space is sort of directly corresponding to the Zeno text experiment in some way, right? And I see that as a nice sort of physical representation of that project in some way, or at least an evocation of the project. So, how do you feel about that, knowing about the Zeno text experiment? What does that lend to the appreciation of the actual folio of prints? I think that probably a lot of poets in the room might acknowledge that when working on a long project, occasionally you get digressions that spiral off of it, work that can't easily be integrated into the final manuscript, but stuff that you might still feel attracted to. The work produced in response to the Xenotext experiment, called A Virus from Outer Space, displayed in the other room, consists of a series of silk screens produced in collaboration with a printmaker named Evelyn Colline, who took an interest in the Xenotext experiment and wanted to collaborate, wanted to produce a work in response to that long-term project. But of course, I actually have nothing really to show for the years of research and the years of work on this poem, except these peripheral projects. And so she commissioned me to write a poem, which I did. It was an anagram based upon the phrase by William S. Burroughs, language is a virus from outer space. I produced 6 permutations of that line that compose a kind of sestet. And she then proceeded to produce these silk screens in response to that poem, including 2 depictions of the genetic code of the bacterium Deinococcus radiodurans, the eventual host for the Xenotext. She also generated a sculpture of the actual protein which grants this organism its
resistance to radioactivity. And the protein has got a hexad symmetry. It's got 6 branches to it. And the poem itself is supposed to be part of the protein ribbons that would be woven through the crystal structure of this molecule. And she then photographed it and did a silk screen of that image. The whole thing is bundled up as a kind of portfolio designed to promote the merits of the Zeno text experiment to potential funding agencies. I've finally managed to garner a grant worth about $120,000 towards the project just this year. And I would say that I was given the grant in part due to these peripheral projects that have arisen around the concept itself. That while I can't actually work on the originating idea, I nevertheless have all of these spin-off projects that have that allude back to it, and I can bring that to corporations, and I can bring that to the government agencies in an effort to actually convince them of its merits.
Great. I just want to open up the floor in case anyone else has questions out there. Yeah.
No, I'll repeat your question. Sure.
I'm wondering about the relationship between your work and high modern or canonical sort of heritage that you interact with. I mean, you translate Rimbaud, you perform Schwitters and Hugo Roll, and you talk about Picasso when you do your prints, and you talk about Burroughs when you do the Zeno text. Is this interpretation or this relationship to literary forebears intrinsic to your text, or is it just a guideline to how we should interpret them, or neither? I mean, would they still be as effective without that sort of background understanding, or without that heritage?
Well, that would be like asking, would these works actually be as effective without immersion in their cultural tradition? I mean, it seems to me that I'm trying to interact with a literary heritage that's pretty well established in an effort to position myself, I suppose, within that long line of predecessors. I happen to be very atheistic about modernism. I wouldn't describe myself as intrinsically modernist in my sensibilities. To me, modernism is primarily about responding to the disappearance of mythological or mythic certainties in life and trying to replace them with an aesthetic myth. The myth of art can provide consolation in a world without value. And I'm, I think, far more nihilistic in my attitudes. I say art does not provide that value, right? It doesn't compensate for the loss of these mythic attributes. And I would say that for that reason, I'm firmly in a postmodern camp. But nevertheless, I'm certainly influenced and informed by a long tradition of modernist avant-garde practice, and they provide, I think, excellent models of technical virtuosity or a series of conceptual forebears that can, I think, be very inspirational. They provide a standard against which I can judge, say, the merits of my own practice and figure out how to improve upon that or augment them or otherwise subvert them, right? I mean, you have to have, I suppose, a springboard from which to operate. And I would like to think that I have a relatively eclectic immersion within that history. I'm very interested in all forms of revolutionary aesthetic practice. I really just like to be adept at a wide variety of avant-garde sensibilities. I would rather not be very specialized in any individual one. I think my attitudes are pretty dilettantish by comparison to far more rigorous practitioners who might look at work outside their own school as heretical or not worthy of consideration.
Would you say that scientific discourse is a form in which these highly successful, attractive, aesthetically pleasing and sort of complex discourse of mythic certainty, or a kind of mythic certainty?
Well, I would suggest that science is so far just the most successful discourse of truth. It just happens to be the quorum of truth that has the most austere value, in modern life. What I find distressing about the fact of poetry's relationship to science, that science is probably now the most important cultural activity that we do as a species. And yet, in the world of poetry, it never figures very prominently. I always joke with my students asking them, what is your favorite poem, canonical work, about the moon landing? And of course, there is no such poem. No poem has ever been written, really, in response to what is probably the greatest collective achievement of humanity, to actually land on an extraterrestrial world. Had the ancient Greeks rowed a trireme to the moon, however, chances are that they would have written a 12-volume epic about that adventure, right? But instead, what was sufficient to provide the foundational text of their culture was to recount the story of a kidnapped fishwife, right? And her eventual rescue. It seems to me that in the modern world, we tend to ignore, as poets, the very important kind of cultural experiences that prevail in our own society. And they include things like genetic engineering and, nuclear warfare and climate change. The sheer extensive impact that science has upon us culturally hasn't been adequately acknowledged by poets. In fact, most poets, I think, regard science as the least poetic of disciplines. And yet now, many scientists in their papers get to indulge in the most grandiose speculations. They indulge in the most outrageous and imaginative poetic exercises. To me, it seems strange that poets are less imaginative now than many of those scientists. And consequently, I've taken, I think, a kind of interest in some of this discourse, some of this language, in part because I probably should have been a scientist rather than a poet, but instead, following my aptitudes, I followed my bliss, thinking that would be my avenue to fame and fortune. And I regretted the decision ever since, right?
About that decision, I'm so interested in these poems you're making for the future, and for a lot of young poets, for me, and for probably a lot of people here at Penn, thanks to your friend Kenny, a lot of our earliest writings have been modeled on the work that you've done already. I wonder what do you think about your role as a teacher, or your work for the future in that regard within this aesthetic tradition?
Well, I think the job of a teacher is not simply to clone themselves, right, but to actually produce the people who will outclass them eventually. The job of the teacher is to produce your successors, the people who will be better than you. And I would be thrilled if I produced a student who went on to exceed, say, my own modest success as a poet. I would be thrilled if that occurred. I also think that as a teacher, especially in an English class, the job of that person is to produce a student who will be incapable of living in their own culture, who will be sufficiently dissatisfied with the experience of their own culture that they have to somehow contribute to it in order to rectify it, to add to it, augment it, or subvert it in some way, whatever that contribution might be. I also hope that by teaching, I might get to learn something in response. I mean, I joke with my students that the relationship between teacher and student should be somewhat vampiric. In part, I'm not supposed to be merely a fount of information. I should also be, I think, learning as much from my students as I have to teach, and that I hope to be able to, benefit from the experience of that interaction as well. And I, in many respects, don't care what my students do, so long as they amaze me. Right? I just say, I don't care what you do, just be amazing. And what is meant by that, I suppose, that they have to make an epistemological contribution. We forget that poetry constitutes a contribution to knowledge, that it is an epistemological activity, that it is supposed to, in fact, provide information, make a discovery, create a surprise. And a lot of poetry doesn't really do that with, I think, the ambitiousness that it might otherwise have. I'm part trying to be a poet myself so that I can teach myself something new about language that I didn't otherwise know, to teach myself a new way of perceiving the world through language, a new way of understanding the medium that I use, in a way that seems surprising, that astonishes me. And I hope to be able to inculcate similar kinds of communal values among my friends and peers.
Okay, are there any pressing questions?
I bet there are.
Running really late.
Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
I speak 2 languages very badly, French and English. I don't speak German at all, no. My background is deep in the gene pool is Norwegian, and I don't know a word of Norwegian either. So.
Great. Did you?
This is a good question. You say you can't wait for the robots to take over, but I think part of the appeal for so many of us of listening to you read and reading your work is picturing you kind of sitting down and playing with these letters and working with them. I think part of the fun for you in writing it must be kind of that aha moment, for example, in the anagrams when you work something out. But there are any number of websites on the internet that have databases of tons of words, and you can type in any phrase and we'll give you a list of all the possible combinations. So how how do you see that kind of fitting into your process? Can you give us a little insight into how you use
I use machines all the time. I use prosthetic devices wherever I can. The machines, however, don't make the act of writing poetry any easier. For example, to translate that paragraph from the patent for Lego would produce automatically such an inordinate number of permutations that you would need a computer then to read and evaluate them all, right? And then you would need to be able to evaluate those assessments, right, to ensure that nothing had been missed. The machine does not make it any easier to do the work. It constitutes a tool just like any other, and I think that once a task has become subsequently free of its labor, what ends up happening is that the artist then redirects their attention to other less adept skills in their own practice. They begin to alter the means by which they produce poetry and the standards by which it's evaluated. To me, it seems that in the future, poets will probably have to range very far outside the catechism of their own literary training. And they may even have to learn how to program machines in order to be able to be competent and relevant poets. They'll have to be able to build devices or tools for themselves that permit them to search large databases or that permit them to permute language in an unusual way that's not satisfied by the average dictionary. And we may appreciate poets in the future not for the quality of the poems that they themselves write, but for the quality of the machines that they themselves program in order to write interesting poems. To me, that seems like a very interesting avenue of potential for the future of poetry. It's one among many potential options that await poets in the future. It just seems to me that if I would really love to be able to collect the royalties from some golden goose that lays a golden egg on my behalf, and I just have to get rid of it. That would be great for a poet, in part because we're lazy and stupid, right? We don't want to work.
Okay, well, we'll end there. We can continue conversation in the back.
Thank you for your indulgence. I appreciate it.